Hello, everybody. Welcome to the last talk of today. I'm very happy to talk to Philippe Pirotte, who's also part of our exhibition/non-exhibition Exposition Imaginaire. Philippe Pirotte is like an art historian and the director of the Städelschule in Frankfurt. In 1999, he co-founded Objective Exhibitions in Antwerp, a small but very prestigious exhibition space. And from 2005 to 2011, he was director of the Kunsthalle Bern. There was many great exhibitions at Kunsthalle Bern, but there is one which was like a co-production with the Centre Pompidou, which is of great interest for us. This it was Voids, a retrospective of empty exhibitions that took place in 2009. Now we see an image of this also like non-exhibition in the background, and my idea was that we start to talk a bit about the exhibition. I mean, it was curated by several people, and you were also like one of the curators of the Bern version. It was an exhibition that started, or maybe like took Yves Klein's 1958 emblematic exhibition, The Specialization of Sensibility in Raw Materials, State into Stabilized Pictorial Sensibility, as a point of departure. This long title was later like more or less like changed to The Void. It's one of the iconic exhibitions of the 50s and is like widely considered as a turning point in modern art history. And this exhibition, the empty space as such, became in a way a classic of like radicalism and would be repeated and remade in other contexts, other places and other times by other artists whose intentions were sometimes like similar, different, or even opposed to Klein's. But I think the interesting thing about the Void exhibition, when you look at images of Kohlefs, like you cannot tell whether the image in the background now is actually like the Yves Klein work exhibition or the exhibition or work of one of the other artists that were in this exhibition. The exhibition consisted of 9 empty rooms. They were arranged in chronological order. So it started with like Yves Klein's exhibition from 1958, followed by Art and Language exhibition from 1966, Robert Barry, 1979, Robert Irwin, 1970, Laurie Parsons, 1990, Bethan Hughes, 1993, Maria Eichhorn, 2001, and Roman Ondok, 2004. I go to the next image. So maybe you can tell a bit about the exhibition at Kunsthalle Bern, because what we actually see is, of course, like images from the exhibition spaces at Kunsthalle Bern, all empty, and I can't even say like whether like labels indicating that this is the room of, say, like Maria Eichhorn as opposed to the one by Art and Language, or was it more like a parcours through the empty?
Yeah, good evening, and thanks for inviting me for the talk. What is interesting is we had, in fact, 10 empty exhibitions in 9 rooms. So that made it impossible to... We had a lot of discussions with John Armleder, Mathieu Copeland, Gustav Metzger, Maito Perre, and Clive Philpott, who were the co-curators of the show, what to do. Because, in fact, we had 10 historical exhibitions or 10 projects, and only 9 rooms. But we also didn't want to build in walls. Every extra temporary wall would become a piece or would become an object in the exhibition space and would kind of like denaturalize the idea of the gesture of emptying out the exhibition space, made out of different motivations by the different artists that we selected here, but or that we did a survey of. So labels were in fact impossible. We had a handout. There was a kind of suggestion which rooms would be what, but the tenth is the one you didn't name, is Stanley Brown. And Stanley Brown said there is somewhere an empty room in the Kunsthalle Bern. But that was totally, in that sense, it was a totally speculative imagination or an imaginative room. It could also be somewhere else in your mind. It's located in the Kunsthalle Bern. It could be an empty space within the empty space. It could be in the how do you say it, like in the roof or somewhere else or in the cellar. So it was a completely different gesture. It was not emptying out a specific room, but it was emptying out an idea of an empty exhibition space. So he went a step further, and it was also the only piece that was not historical, that was a contemporary intervention. What was for us very important, I think, for this exhibition is that it still had, or it has, an exhibition space. It was very, very important to have an institution, an architecture, a space that has a history of showing art. And we also had a historical one in our exhibition history. That was the Maria Eichhorn one. So it kind of like repeated itself within the retrospective. But in the retrospective, it had not anymore. It's very, so all these different exhibitions were very specific. And in a way, it lost its specificity. The only thing was, in fact, you were impelled in the rooms to start to imagine as much as you could imagine with the kind of the titles, the concepts, the explanations of the shows. There was an enormous book with it. I have it here. It's very big, enormous book, which is a bit of a paradox. It's kind of like very full. It's not a void. It's which made an artist, a friend artist, during Liste some years ago, to have a scale with 15 of these books on it, and it was called The Weight of Voids. So the paradox of the show was constantly this oscillation or this dialectics between materiality and immateriality, imagination and reality. For example, the Beta News void was in fact done in Langehaus Esters. It was in House Esters, I think, yeah. And she thought the building of Mies van der Rohe was so beautiful that she kind of appropriated the building as an object and left it empty. But it's a very different gesture than the Yves Klein one. The Yves Klein had nothing to do with the aesthetics of the architecture of the building or the space where he was showing his work. Or Roman Ondak kind of like hid an eavesdropping device in a wall. So the exhibition was empty, but it kind of like induced the whole notion of paranoia. So it was always very specific, all these historical voids. There are more, of course. The book kind of lists more. Most of them we call them quasi-voids because some of those were not completely empty. So Mathieu Copeland was very, very strict in selecting the pieces. And I personally was very happy to host it at the Kunsthalle Bern because it had one of those historical ones. And secondly, to me, it looked better as in the Pompidou, because in Pompidou it was a part of a parcours, of an exhibition parcours that was kept empty at the end of a certain floor. And you had constantly the impression that it was just a space that was not installed, that it was a space where they were waiting to install an exhibition. While in the Kunsthalle Bern, the ritual of entering a completely empty building as one bigger gesture of then the curators in order to invoke these different historical voids was much more poignant, I think. In the Pompidou, it had a very beautiful nonchalance to it, but in Bern, it had a very almost a ritualistic experience when you came in.
But if we take, for instance, Maria Eichhorn's piece as an example, it's called Money. Mm-hmm. And it's a result from her research into funding of the exhibition, and she repeated it in a way now recently at Chisenhell Gallery in a slightly like different version. But her decision was to devote the budget for her show for the renovation of the building. Mm-hmm. And that, of course, is a highly ideological piece. And what I ask myself, how, if in a way, when you show these exhibitions, I mean, it's a kind of how do you say, reenactment of something very site-specific. How did the audience respond to that? Because, I mean, when it's not even clear whether, Maria Eichhorn was actually, the first room or the fourth room, etc. I mean, it's very, very, of course, interesting in the context of our, exposition imaginaire and the related topics of like what do you actually get when you look at images.
Well, the Maria Eichhorn one was more than just a specific place in the Kunsthalle. Again, we couldn't allocate a room to one of the historical voids because they all had very different, kind of very concrete aspects. So the show was always its own paradox. A lot of the Maria Eichhorn work was done in the storage place or was done in the elevator. So when she devoted the budget for her show in kind of like a refurbishing of the building or a restoration of parts of the building, the actual work went into glass ceilings, parts of the elevator doors, I don't know what, many different things, which is something we could not reenact. So the kind of retrospective was full of these type of paradoxes. We could not reenact the specificity of each void. So what we did was, in fact, we repeated the gesture as curators, and we kind of emptied the Kunsthalle. And it was a curatorial gesture. And we then based ourselves on, okay, these are the historical examples. This is, we have to accept it, a retrospective of these empty exhibitions. And that's because there was the handout and a small guide with short explanations, the big book, etc. So there was a constant dialectic between the book or the text or the explanation of the work and the experience at the Kunsthalle. How people reacted, it was very interesting. It was one of my last shows during the time I was there, and locally, it was very divided. A lot of people thought it was a provocation. A lot of people thought it was laziness. It was a kind of a gratuit gesture. On the other hand, there were people that knew about the work of Maria Eichhorn because it was not so long before. And there were a lot of people that also remembered that Stanley Brown, although it was not an empty exhibition, had also an exhibition at the Kunsthalle Bern. So that there was a kind of seriousness that was kind of perceived. And we had a lot, but not in the Kunsthalle. Outside of the Kunsthalle, we had a lot of discursive events. So we had lectures, we had Ben Vautier doing a performance relating to his own emptying of exhibition spaces, etc. We had Pavel Büchler, who was talking about the fact that he emptied the show in Prague before during communist times still, as a premonitive gesture before censorship could come, etc. So he emptied out his exhibition before it would be censored. And so we had a whole discursive program, which made it still by a lot of people being perceived as a very serious undertaking. But in general, of course, Bern is a small city. The local public was kind of like, okay, there was a lot of media attention to it because it was sensed, of course, as a first-degree provocation.
You presented the book, which is, of course, a very good also like collection of source material, because you were also like quite radical in the exhibition itself. You refused to add, for instance, like historical material and terms of like invitation cards or like posters or press clippings. That's all in the book, more or less. But then, of course, like what of course I don't share that, but what one could ask oneself is like, does it really need the exhibition? Absolutely. Because of course, like you can tell about the concept and say like, okay, there is this like, you know, historical shows and it's all about the void, it's about nothingness, and it could be like an instruction, like, you know, empty out your studio, close your eyes, and think you are in an Yves Klein exhibition.
No, I think it absolutely needs the exhibition, and I think I shared this thought with colleagues that conceived the exhibition, that it's about an experience also, and it was never intended to be a documentary exhibition. It was never intended to be a documentary retrospective with kind of like material, with notes, with photographs, etc. I think it's we really like refuse to step into let's say a Boris Groys idea of the document, you know, the document as kind of like becoming an artwork, because it's been shown so much since the 90s, since the documentary turned contemporary art. And we thought the document, we keep it really in its notion very clear as document within the book. That's the status. It can be displayed, it can be in a book, it can be in many different things, but it's not an exhibition. And it's not a substitute for the exhibition. And we thought that the experience of the exhibition, which was kind of like, again, a gesture that we as curators, we reenacted, in fact, the gestures of the artists. The kind of idea like, okay, we empty out the exhibition space and you are invited to imagine with us or to experience with us. And of course, it's on a meta level. If you have to imagine art in language, air conditioning show, it's a different thing than trying to imagine an empty space somewhere at Kunsthalle Bern by Stanley Brown. So we had guides. We had vigilants, we had guides, we had people that could give explanation. It was in fact the vigilants who had a basic knowledge of the different exhibitions that were part of the retrospective. And so the conversations were important, the conversations with people. When I showed up, or some of the co-curators, or some of the assistants, we engaged in conversations with the people about the very different shows that were kind of like invoked or as an epiphany kind of like brought about. And again, it was because I forgot one other artist that had also already had a show at Kunsthalle Bern, which was Beta News. And Beta News did a couple of times, she kind of like added floors to the existing floor. In the main room of the Kunsthalle, she kind of doubled the floor. That was her solo exhibition years before. And she then was invited to be part of this retrospective to kind of like reimagine her house Esther's show. So there were a lot of kind of like anchor points and conversation entries and trying to explain why an artist came at this point to do that. We had a show but a couple of years before around Alan Capro. And then it was very easy to make the jump to Laurie Parsons. Alan Capro, who never really completely stepped out of the art world, but he stepped out of the relationship with the public. And Laurie Parsons, who stepped out of the art world. And these kind of like, you could tissue a certain story that kind of had a certain thickness. So we did a lot of efforts on the discursive level to compensate for, or to kind of like not compensate, but to kind of take on reactions that would be immediately dismissive and kind of like try to get people into a conversation about this. Yeah.
What I really like about the concept of the show is all of a sudden you get an awareness that certain more like recent positions, like for instance the Maria Eichhorn or like Roman Ondak, I think they would not be possible without these like earlier examples of like empty spaces. So all of a sudden you have like a certain like history of the void you can refer to, which also makes it easier to, in a way, focus on one aspect of invisible or not. No artworks in the show, which is part of some of this historical concept, and shift to focus, for instance, to like more institutional questions, like in the case, for instance, of Maria Eichhorn. But it's to come back to that. I mean, it's really interesting to look at these photos, which are really like crappy photos I just like downloaded from the website of Kunsthalle Bern. I mean, you see nothing. I mean, it's without context.
It's a very beautiful Kunsthalle.
It's a very beautiful building, yeah. But I mean, which is also like a very important question in the Exhibition Imaginaire. That, of course, like lots of images circulate, and you can have a look at exhibitions abroad without having been there. We had lots of talks that were about the current Berlin Biennial, which I haven't seen, but at least I had a look at lots of like artworks via Instagram, via Facebook posts. I mean, I watched like some TV clips featuring artworks and interviews with the curators, and all of a sudden I had the idea like, wow, I mean, at least I can follow a conversation. I know what it's about, and sometimes you even feel like, oh God, I don't need to go there. I mean, I got it already. But looking at these images, of course, you have the feeling like, no, nothing can actually like replace the like physical presence in that space. Although, of course, it looks like a paradox because there is literally like nothing to see.
No, I think that's really true. It's very important, and it was one of our aims to kind of like create or reinstall that desire of people to come to that space, and to kind of like, it's maybe the disbelief that would maybe impel people to come, you know? Is it really empty? Is it really total? And what is then to see, and to what our attention goes? And then you come, in fact, very close. I think the piece that was mostly in vogue was Robert Irwin's piece, which is kind of like an empty exhibition space where you are impelled to look at very, very slight differences in the white in the wall, or very, very specific material oddities, or not even oddities, like very, very tiny details. And that's what a lot of people came to do, you know, that you hasten the experience of what is an exhibition space, what is all there. There is all the radiators. And again, Kunsthalle Bern had a very historical other empty exhibition, was Michael Asher. And Michael Asher kind of like brought all the radiators in the entrance hall and connected them, so they were still functioning. But all the rest of the Kunsthalle was empty. But it was not a classical one enough to take on in the retrospective. But there was a big amount of reasons for John Armleder and Mathieu and Maitu and myself to host that exhibition there, because it called in a lot of historical shows that happened there. David Hammond's show was, except for blue filters on the windows, completely empty till the last room in the cellar where there was a drum kit with a cat, etc., etc. So there is an enormous amount of historical, let's say, exercise towards this retrospective within the biography of exhibitions at the Kunsthalle Bern. And I think it's really true that you start to see a lot more. Which is, of course, an obvious and normal trick. If there is a little thing in a show, that you start to look much more to the architectural context or the atmosphere, etc. But that was absolutely the case. And we also really kept it in a very regular exhibition period. So it was 1.5 months empty.
What did you do afterwards? What did you show afterwards?
I don't remember by heart. I think we did an Olivier Mosset show, and together with Su Zhen from China. Yeah, we did I think it was the show after that, but I'm not completely sure anymore.
What I really like is the description of the Robert Barrer piece, that it invites the visitor to consider the exhibition space not for what it is, nor for what it has to show, but as a place to meet and reflect. So, did you have the feeling that because there was nothing on show, or like there was something on show, but it was no like visible artworks, but exhibitions, that the visitors started to talk and discuss more than usual?
I don't know, because at a certain moment I was not there, because I became a father at the same moment that this show happened. So I was on paternal leave, or how is it called, in the midst of the show. Unless we organized it ourselves with the discursive program, etc., I don't know if it really enhanced a lot of conversation. We tried with some shows before. That was not on purpose, but there were some shows before that kind of like induced this type of conversation. Certainly the Alan Capro show, which was also kind of a retrospective, and which happened 2 years before. So the Bernese public and the School of the Arts, they were used to kind of like this kind of like exhibitions where a lot of participatory, or let's say at least contemplative participatory action was to be taken. So there was a bit of a prehistory. There was a context to do that, but I'm not completely sure whether I didn't check it literally to see how people would kind of like engage in their own conversations. That I couldn't say. I know there was a lot of, in the beginning it was a big row, and there was a lot of press, and there was a lot of laughing, and there was a lot of is this possible? Why is he doing this? Are they just kind of like doing a provocation towards the taxpayer and all that kind of stuff? And after a while this dust settled, and people engaged with the show. And the good thing was, it was a absolutely not less visited show than any others. That was a quite interesting thing. It reached an average of public attendance, like let's say, in comparison with the other shows. That was a quite interesting thing. I thought it was going to be dropping in public attendance because people don't have to go in.
It was in 2009, and do you have the feeling that at that time already there was also like a kind of like fatigue, that people had the idea like there is too much art, there is this overabundance of exhibitions, and that could be like a kind of like relief that you don't have to focus on I don't know how many artworks in a show, but just like can mediate the exhibition as such? Or maybe that was too early.
I think it was more of a vogue amongst curators at that time. It was the time, okay, we did Capro, Adam Szymczyk was doing his Lee Lozano show, Chris Gruithuis did the Bastiaan Ader show. We were revisiting these positions of people that were stepping out. And I think it was a feeling that probably maybe conscious or unconscious existed amongst curators to react against at that time starting to kind of blow up market. The market blew up enormously then. The thing we still live today, but now we are thinking there might be a correction in the market, etc. But in that time, it was kind of like burgeoning like hell. And certainly in Switzerland with Art Basel, and then Basel was going to take over Hong Kong, and all these kind of things were already in the air. And I think it was a curatorial, I wouldn't say a fashion, but a certain interest that we shared with a lot of colleagues to think about all these gestures. And it's maybe almost a very dramatic thing amongst curators. Let's look at these things, those artists that were in fact refusing to just produce and that were kind of like really reflecting on how much a production would become a commodity, etc., etc. So like Lee Lozano, who stepped out of the art world, Laurie Parsons, who stepped out of the art world, Capro, who started to do gestures that are not even recorded anymore. That were all the things that I think people were interested in. And I personally was interested also in more contemporary conceptual practices like Maria Eichhorn, like Roman Ondijk, like Pavel Büchler, etc., like many others. But today they're not so visible. That's quite interesting. Of course, Maria Eichhorn is again there with a very similar gesture in South London Gallery, kind of like giving off to the staff in a certain sense. They can take on their holidays, or they are free from labor. They don't have to work. Which is again a very interesting gesture at this moment. Also, it's kind of like, because what we have now in the art world is already not now, just now, but already since more than a decade, is this whole idea that labor is pleasure, or our pleasure is our labor and our labor is our pleasure. We are the kind of like the perfect inventors, or have been the laboratory for neoliberal labor conditions. And I think it's probably a gesture to think about that what Maria Eichhorn proposed for the South London Gallery. And I think it's very important to have this self-reflection in amongst artists and in the art world about labor conditions that we might just endorse without being too conscious what we endorse, or which we kind of invent or inhabit. And of course, again, it's a part of a lot of paradoxes. It's very difficult to be on the one hand enthusiast, but on the other hand stay bureaucratic with your labor hours in the art world. So I think that's a very interesting paradox.
Do you think these radical gestures of the no are still possible?
Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't they be possible? I don't know. I think they exist. Probably the radical. I know people that are not online. I know people and I know curators and artists, and it's a number of friends that they don't do Facebook, Instagram, or anything. They barely write mails. So the thing is their radical gesture perceivable? And that's the whole story. Does a radical gesture need to be dramatically executed? It can also be a withdrawal that is not dramatically executed. And in that sense, I forwarded you some information on a very interesting artist, Meyer Weissman, who we did a show with in Porticus very recently, last year. And Meyer Weissman was one of those incredibly hyped artists in the early 80s. He was a co-founder of, I don't know, it doesn't matter if we can't show it. I can tell about it. And he founded this gallery together with Heather Coury and one third person, which was international with Monument. And it was a very interesting premonition on how artists kind of process the media at that time, and the beginning of like computer generated imagery, etc. And we showed it in his work in Portuguese because I wanted to show the kind of like introduce our students to an artist who was kind of like doing experiments in the direction of what everybody is obsessed with today, but already in '83. Not only him, but also Peter Halley, Ashley Bickerton. That was the whole group, the Fantastic Four they were called, that was starting this gallery. Jeff Koons had some of his first shows there, Richard Prince, etc. And they were the kind of the generation or the group that a lot of people that are now the aesthetics you see at the Berlin Biennial or the post-internet art, etc., is I think very much indebted to some of these people. They try to do that in the first round. But some of them are of course known. Jeff Koons is very known, but the other ones are kind of, for the generation that is studying at Städelschule or somewhere else, they are forgotten or not known, etc. And it's this very interesting thing how Meyer Weissman on the one hand completely lives in media, and on the other hand doesn't exist. He withdrew also completely from the art world. He was a big star up till, let's say, the late 80s, and he had some personal breakdowns, heavy psychological problems, and he withdrew from the machinery and started to make completely different art, which was very interesting after painting that was never executed by himself, was always very important, was always done by assistants or by machines or by programming machines. So he was extremely interested in computer-generated imagery. He was doing one of the very first 3D scans of his own skeleton, for example, the moment it was possible. It doesn't matter, it's good to imagine these things too. And at a certain moment, he also completely withdrew. And then a couple of years ago, he started to paint again. But his painting is inkjet print on wood, and what is very interesting is the procedure. He doesn't make the drawings even. In fact, he is on Skype with an assistant that he never met. He only knows her through, in fact, Skype. He identified her through advertisement or a contact situation on internet. It's an art student somewhere. And he talks to her, and she makes the drawings for the prints. And then he looks at them and he corrects them, but not with his hands or not on his computer, by talking to her again. It's like, okay, this doesn't look right, but it has to look like this. And so he kind of like creates the whole exhibition and all the works. It's a very, very interesting thing to kind of, it's using the contemporary media at its fullest, but at the same time primitivizing it. It's not kind of like using the toolbox to its fullest for himself. He kind of like delegates that, which I thought was very interesting. He delegates it, but he's very present, and he knows what he wants to have, and he knows the type of imagery he wants to have. And the imagery is not old-fashioned. The imagery is totally actual. And at the same time, he didn't show up at the opening of the exhibition, but he was present through FaceTime. He was in Israel, and a friend of his kind of like was in permanent contact with him, and he could look at the show, etc. He didn't install it himself. So it was a very consequent way of creating distance, which was part of his early concept in the 80s. And in the 90s, he had different type. It was very conceptual and politically committed work about the situation of shanty towns in Venezuela. So he made this detour and came back to the art world. Now he withdrew again because it's something for personal reasons, he doesn't want to be part of it anymore. And he refused to sell the work. He refused to publish the work, etc., etc. So it's so these radical positions. Let's say it might be not as radical as Laurie Parsons that's completely disappeared, but there is this negotiation of this participation or not in these things, and with an incredible knowledge of contemporary working of media. And Meyer is present on Facebook and on Instagram. But he's not present himself. He's gone. He's somewhere.
But is the does he talk about the way he produces his work? Is that part of it? Yeah.
Yes. At least he talked to me about it when I did the studio visit. But the studio visit was just him, his computer, and in his apartment in Barcelona in that time. Yes, of course, he talks about it. He knows exactly why he wants to do certain things, what he wants to achieve. There is some text-based works, there is other works, but he never touches himself, let's say, Paintbox or Photoshop or whatever. He doesn't touch it. It's only conversation. But he has a very, very clear conversation and a discursive, how to say it, like built-up story on what he wants to have. Absolutely, yes. It's not the assistant's work. It's his work. It's very interesting, and she has to first imagine, and then he reacts and he corrects till he has what he has. But it's a very interesting thing. I think this relationship with this assistant, which is very distant because it's totally done through Skype and email and other things, is really also part of the conception of the work and the development of the work. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds really like a very interesting post-conceptual approach.
Mm-hmm.
The photo in the background, that's an installation view from Porticus, and Porticus is somehow like the Art Academy's gallery. Mm-hmm. So what I would be interested in is like, how did the students of the Städelschule respond to that? Because on the one hand, it's very close to what they do, and on the other hand, it's like something completely different. And I think for me, of course, we are also like born in times where before the internet, so we know both. We know the analog world and the digital world, and for me, this makes complete like sense to play with what's possible. But the result, of course, as you said, does not look like something that is generated or produced with the help of really like very advanced like communication tools, feedback loops, etc.
Well, I think as far as I could kind of like scan the reactions or have feedback on what the students thought, I think the students were amazed by the fact that this was a person some might have known about him, but a lot of them didn't know about him. So there was, I think, quite some research towards his earlier work. Who was this person? What did he do? Why was he once as famous as Jeff Koons and those kind of things? I think towards the show, there was a lot of reactions that were very by kind of like fascinated people, fascinated students by the fact that it's also there was an anachronistic part in it because everything was on wood, so it kind of referred to old painting, like painting on wood. You know, everything was printed on wood, and it was very clear. Hung as painting, it was within a painting context, etc. But I think there was a very interesting group, like for example, Michael Kreber's class was very interested. It's divided, of course, but there was an absolute interest because there's so much painting at the moment, also at the school. But I think they were surprised, and there was the frustration that he was not there. There was the frustration that he could not do a talk. There was the frustration that he didn't do studio visits, I think. And it was difficult to compensate that. We couldn't make a book because he would not allow us to make a book. He adopted a very strict Orthodox Jewish kind of attitude and practice, and he's kind of like dismissing a lot of his own works, which added to the complexity and the distance, etc. So it was very difficult to mediate the work. The work was, the show was mediated enormously in the press. We had a lot of press, which was quite amazing because it was really the reintroduction of this artist to the art world, and that generated a lot of press. And I think the reactions at the school amongst the students were ambiguous in the sense I don't know whether they knew what to do with it. You know, to some it said things, to others it didn't say anything. Who was that? Who is this old guy from the 80s that makes work that looks like our generation and not? A very, very, very strange mix of reactions, I think. It's like towards other shows, it's much more easy, the reactions they have. That's what I also liked about it, to do this show. I think it's much more interesting to have this situation where you don't know upfront how people are gonna react. You are very how do you say, the outcome is very unpredictable. There was a lot of institutional interest, but nobody committed afterwards. It was not that it was not taken up in museum collections or anything. So that was all very interesting. It was like, what is this? Where is this? Where is this now? What does that mean? But I never really do a proactive rundfrage amongst the students. You know, when I get the reactions, that's fine. And that's always individuals. And individually, there has been some people that really engaged with it, yes.
No, I was wondering, because, I mean, this is like an interesting hybrid between old school, conceptual approach and something very recent, like how you distribute also, like, not the work, but also images of the work. How do you place yourself within the artwork, but of course, like with a radical gesture of like not participating, not wanting to the images to circulate, not wanting everybody having the same opinion about it. So if you think that this is like same generation as Jeff Koons, this is quite the opposite. And I was wondering, I mean, you are the dean of one of the most successful, or one of the most successful art schools in the world, I would say, because, I mean, Städler is very small. It still has about, I think, 150 students.
A bit more.
A bit more now. But from all over the world. It has very famous professors, and in a way it has always been very strong in making people get interested in also what the students do, because the students have a lot of freedom to develop their own ideas. So it's a different kind of system. I mean, it's not the kind of like class system that we know from more traditional academies. But at the same time, I mean, when I lived in Frankfurt, that was between 2006. Before 2001 and 2006. I already felt there was quite a pressure on the students in a way to position themselves in this like more globalized art world. And lots of them asked me, I was a very young curator at that time, like what they should do in order to become successful in this mixture of like being, I don't know, a bit naive, but also like troubled, because they knew somehow they have to distribute the work, somehow they have to network, and that was before like everybody was on Facebook, Instagram, etc. So has the pressure become like stronger, or do you protect the students from this pressure also by like showing, examples like this, which are, I mean, for me as a student, that would be like a great source of inspiration?
Well, it's a lot of questions. The pressure is there, absolutely, sadly so. Sometimes I think it's maybe good to have a bit of pressure because it's also a reality check, but on the other hand, the pressure is quite enormous. The pressure gets bigger the moment people start indeed to more and more say how successful that school is, etc. So amongst each other, there is a lot of peer pressure, which is hard to take away. And I think an example of an exhibition with Mayor Weissman was I always think like there are propositions. It's a proposition, and I think it's to them to research further. It's to them to kind of take the decision, I want to know more about this, and then we can help. I don't think, I didn't want to contextualize this show, for example, too much as an example of somebody who deals with it in a certain way. And certainly not as an example to follow. I think that would be completely wrong. I think they have to develop their own ways. There's many different examples on how to pressure and how to deal with market pressure, etc. And of course, they are the first generation that became adult within a world where the art market was very big and strong and burgeoning and flamboyant and all that kind of stuff. I think I started to work in the art world exactly when the first market crisis was there, which is very different. Or I started not to work, but kind of to look into the art world, which is very different. So I don't think I can think for them, or somebody of my generation can think for them in relation to such a situation. The only thing I hope to do as a dean of the school with some of the professors is to diversify the propositions And the Stedelschulen is always built on proximity, and it's on proximity with certain professors. It's the proximity with the people that show at Porticus. It's this kind of like first-hand experience with other artists, with peers, older, more successful, less successful, doesn't matter. And I think that's a system that, it's not even a system, but it's a kind of a habit that we should continue. And this proximity is something they also cherish. And sometimes they organize it themselves, you know, like they want to have the proximity of a certain author or a certain artist, and they organize it themselves. And I think they also, sometimes they refuse the broader public presence and work within very, very idiosyncratic networks, etc. And it's all reactions indeed on this outside world, this big art world, this so many art worlds that want things from you. And I think it's this finding this balance on how much you give or don't give, or if you want to give. It's all very personal. It's something they discuss amongst each others. Whether they have to make things that become commodities or not, how they relate to being present on social media or not, and all that kind of stuff. But we offer, I hope we offer as much as possible differentiation. We had a lecture by I forgot his name, but the person that founded Contemporary Art Daily. But we also had a lecture by...
He's actually in the audience right now.
Okay, very good.
Forrest Nash.
Okay, very good. But we also had a lecture by an artist that founded an art village in Senegal in the 70s, and which is in a very different way of dealing and developing politics, and different ways to show works, or not showing works, or refusing to participate in documenta, for example, which this person did, etc., etc., etc. And I think I personally, for sure not, but I think most of the professors, we don't want to kind of like bring in examples that could be followed. I think we just try to organize the proximity with as diverse people possible from the art world, but also beyond. Also people from the literature world, other worlds, etc. And so now we are very happy. We will have a seminar with Claire Denis for our students, and she will come for a whole week, which is quite exceptional. And I think such moments are very important for the students to kind of like rethink also their own positions. But I can't deny there is pressure, but I also don't want to be naive. I don't think a school can claim or try or find methods to take that away. Otherwise, it's an ivory tower, and they will, when they finish their school period, they will kind of like be totally vulnerable to all these things that happen. Our school is very open with all the advantages and disadvantages. We don't close at 6 or 8. You know, they can still go in their studio at midnight or at 4 o'clock in the morning. During the day, I sometimes bump into galleries that go into studios, and I'm like not so happy with that. But yeah, that's what happens. You know, it's of course it's a challenge towards the future, and something we try to amongst the professors also see that we don't become, for example, how do you say that in English? An Anlieferungsstelle for a certain network or for a certain gallery circuit. So that's something we'll have to really look how to diversify that. And it can also frustrate some of our students, I think, because some students count also on a specific way to start a career. And it could be very frustrating when we maybe reorganize parts of the school, you know, into other ideas. And I think, for me personally, I think the fact that we live in a world with multiple art worlds is I think something which is a big challenge for Stedelschulen to accept and to deal with. So we had guest professors like Hassan Khan and Otto Bongenkanga. Meir Weisman is in fact from Venezuela, and a lot of his work kind of like organizes feedbacks to political situations in Venezuela, etc. But they are also part of the New York art world, and I think that's a part of the whole notion of diversity that I would like to kind of like enhance at the school without being naive. It's not about being exhaustive about the global, but given that we, for example, have so many applications out of South Korea, I think it's important for us to be interested in the art world in South Korea, in Seoul, and that's the way we try to develop. I hope the challenges for the future. Yeah.
So the Void should be part of the curriculum too.
Probably yes. In the discursive part for art theory and art history, I think I didn't do seminars about this exhibition, but that might be in the near future once. Yes.
Thank you very much, Philippe. We have quite an audience here live, and I think we should take the past 10 minutes to ask if anybody has a question, because this is always the privilege of the live audience. Anybody? Monica Bonvicini has a question.
Hello, Monica.
Hi, Philippe.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, very good, thanks. Very interesting talk. My question is quite simple. I was wondering how the artists who participated to your show in Bern about the Void, how did they feel it? How did they think about it? Because I can imagine when you come, I mean the alive one.
Exactly.
Of course. Because I can imagine when you do a show and you show nothing, which is, as we heard, really never, never nothing. But it's quite a radical choice to do. And then if you are put in, if you're put together with some other radical acts, it must be kind of strange. I don't know. How?
The ones indeed that are alive were, well, one didn't react. Laurie Parsons, for example, didn't react. We didn't find her. We don't know. I don't even know if she's probably still alive, but she's unreachable, unfindable. But Roman Ondak and Stanley Brown. Stanley Brown was kind of, how do you say it? He decided for himself he would never do group shows anymore. So his project reacted also of the fact that he had to be part of a group show, and so he kind of like made his participation almost independent within the group show. So there were interesting. Robert Barry was very, very happy. Maria Eichhorn was totally into it. That was all not such a problem. I think everybody was that the interesting thing was a lot of artists were angry they were not in it. There were many artists that had voids or quasi-voids that were hoping to be in it, and that was a kind of an interesting thing. The book is as shown, is this very big fat thing, but this book and the exhibition generated material to make a second book like that, because so many people reacted on it. So many people said, "Oh, but there was a void over there, and somebody made this gesture there, and there is this text over there." And I think we could have made an extra volume, which we didn't do, but there is material to make an extra volume, which is the second part of this. So Seal Floyer reacted, etc. So it was quite interesting in that sense. But none of the artists was against it. Most of the group that are here, they thought it was a fantastic initiative. And of course, there was also some people that in the curatorial team that they knew or that they were friends with, like Gustav Metzger or Maitu or John, which kind of made everything very smooth in that sense. The only thing was the discussions we had was like, okay, are we building walls, or in order to have 10 rooms, or are we doing labels, or are we doing a discursive program, and that kind of things. And there a lot of opinions differed, absolutely.
So I think everybody in the audience is hoping that you will indeed do this second volume.
That's
Please.
It's a lot of work, but the material is in Kunsthalle Bern. In fact, the correspondence is the whole archive that was built up after the Voids exhibition, and I think Mathieu Copeland compiled a lot for himself, compiled a lot of the information.
Okay, we'll persuade him. He was part of this program too. Thank you so much, Philip. Hope to see you soon and live in Vienna.
Yes.
But I'm very happy the connection was very good. And thank you, dear audience, both here at Kunsthalle Wien and somewhere out there in the World Wide Web. See you tomorrow.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Yeah.
Ciao.
Ciao.